Welcome to some of you. My name's Paul. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're new with us, thanks so much for coming. And as a lot of you guys know, we are working through Romans. Last week we took a little break. It was our first Sunday, so we did the Intentional Life series, and that one was on thinking. And if you missed that, you can sure check that out online if you want to listen to it. But we're back in Romans now. We're going to be picking up in Romans chapter 7. But before we start, I'd just like to pray together. Well, Father, we ask God that this morning that you would work your power into this time of worship, that we would be moved, that we would be changed, that we would understand your law a little bit better, that we would understand how we need to fight against sin and battle against sin and the importance of that. And Lord, I just pray that this morning, God, that we would come to know you more, that we would be thankful for who you are, that we would be grateful for what you've done for us and what you continue to do for us. And I would just pray, God, for anyone here who doesn't know you, God, that somehow through this brief message and through the singing and through the fellowship, Lord, you would draw them to yourself and they would be saved. Lord, I thank you so much for this great opportunity to open your word as a church and to look at it together and to enjoy it and to learn. And God, I just pray that you would be with us, fill us with your spirit, and incline our hearts towards you this morning, I pray. Amen. All right, so open up to chapter 7. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 12 this morning and talk about 13 a little bit because it's kind of a transition verse. But just to reiterate what Mike had talked about 2 weeks ago, Paul was kind of using the metaphor of marriage to talk about, a married woman is married to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. And Paul was using that example of, hey, we were under the law, but once we've died to the law through Christ, the law is no longer our husband in a sense, and now we have this new husband. We have Christ. So we're no longer under the law, but we're under grace. And so he's really been hitting the law hard, hasn't he? For, pretty much the last 2 chapters or so, it's just been more and more law this, law that, law this. Well, he's going to keep going. So I hope you're not tired of it. And if you are, too bad, because that's where we're going. But let's just pick up in verse 7, where Paul writes this. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy. And the commandment is holy and righteous and good. So ever since the end of chapter 5, Paul's been answering question after question about the law and its role and purpose. And if you remember, Paul ended chapter 5 with these words, and I think I have it on the screen for you up here, but now the law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more, so that as sin reigned in death, grace also might reign through righteousness, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So it's this statement and all the ones that we looked at before this that's revealing the truth to us that the law cannot save us, but only Jesus can by grace. And that would have created a lot of confusion and frustration for anyone who had any knowledge of the law whatsoever, especially the Jews. They would have been saying okay, well, how could this be? How could you say these things, Paul, about the law? You're supposed to be a Pharisee, right? How can you say these things against the law? And in chapter 6 and 7, Paul deals with questions that they would have asked. Remember, he asked this question, okay, are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Should we just keep sinning so that more and more grace can be poured into our life to show God as being glorious? He said, by no means, absolutely not. And then he answered the question, are we to sin because we're not under law, but under grace? Still, the same idea, just a different way of phrasing it. And he answers to both of those, by no means. And then he brings up another question here in verse 7. What then shall we say? Given all I've just said against the law, what then shall we say? That the law is sin? Now, where does this question come from? Well, given the fact that, what Paul's said about the law thus far, it would be easy to imagine that Paul thought the law was evil and sinful in and of itself, right? I mean, when you look back at all these things that we've talked about the law, you logically look at it and say, yeah, that's just as bad as sin. He talks about sin as being evil. The law must be evil too. Well, Paul actually responds in the negative. Again, he says, by no means. I love how Paul repeats himself. You can really get the pattern of Paul in his writing of this is how he communicates an argument. It's really, really helpful. But why does he say by no means? It seems like he would say the opposite, but he doesn't. And he spends the rest of this section arguing against that idea. So he begins with the rest of verse 7. If it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So right here he answers the question, is the law sin? No, it can't be. Clearly, Paul shows them to be two separate things. He refers to them separately in this section. There's the law and there's sin. And we see here why it would get so confusing for those who knew the law. Paul says here it's because of the law that Paul became aware of sin, right? How can the law be good if it made me aware of sin? If it's increasing this. And we've talked about this many times before, and we don't need to repeat, what we've talked about in the past. But in short, what the law does, and what people would have been confused about, is they would have looked at it as like moral standards, all these things. But what the law really does is it reveals our sin to us. It opens up our eyes so that we can see that we're actually sinning against God. And he mentioned this in chapter 3 of Romans, verse 20. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his God's sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. Then he explains by way of example in the rest of verse 7. For I would not have known. I would have no idea. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Now it's important to note that in this section we see Paul referring to himself in kind of an experiential way. And he says he would not have known. In the next verses he talks about I was alive and then I'm dead. So these verses can be looked at as kind of autobiographical, and they are in a sense. But you don't want to stop there. The point of this section is not whether Paul's writing this about himself or anything. This is a universal thing that all of us really experience in regards to the law and sin. So the main point's not the autobiography. It's rather law and the evil of sin and how we should view it as Christians. So here Paul says that if it wasn't for the law, he would have never known that coveting was wrong if the law had not said it was wrong. And it's interesting that he uses this commandment, the commandment not to covet. It's really interesting that he uses that. Why would he choose that? Why not stealing or bearing false witness? Why wouldn't you pick some of those other ones? Well, is it because that was what he experienced and that's why he's sharing it? Yeah, it's possible. It's possible that Paul experienced coveting and that's why he was talking about, hey, this is me. But I also think that there's some other reason. All those other commandments, don't murder, don't steal, remember the Sabbath. Those are actions. Those are things we do. Those are things we actually have to physically do. But to not covet isn't an action. That's something internal. That's an internal desire. That's not something you're doing, it's something you're thinking. So, many people end up viewing sin incorrectly, and they would say, well, that sin is just when I do the bad thing. It's not when I think the bad thing, it's just when I do the bad thing that's sin. And Paul says, no. The desire itself is sinful. Now think about the Pharisees. They were following the law as far as they understood it. And, I fast twice a week, and I'm better than everybody else because I follow the law. The thing is, they were actually doing those things. So we would have probably looked at them and said, yeah, those are good guys because they're following the law to the letter. But they didn't have the spirit of the law in their hearts, and so they were actually wicked inside. The desires of their heart were wicked, even though on the outside they were doing all these good things. So that's what coveting is. It's desiring something that's not yours and wanting it for yourself, and it's just a wicked desire. And so someone might ask, okay, well, but wait a second. If I'm not acting out on those internal desires, I'm not actually sinning, right? And Paul's saying, no, that's not true. And let me give you an example that hopefully will put this to rest. So I was once talking to a woman, and this was like probably 7 or 8 years ago now, who had mentioned that at one point her husband and her had a man that were living with them, and their marriage was kind of in a bad spot. So the woman began to, in her own words, have an affair with this other man in her mind. Okay? So she never actually acted out on that thought. Nothing ever happened there. But when she was talking to me, she was just saying, I know absolutely that was sin. Like my desires were sinful. I was sinning against God and my husband. And her thoughts alone were enough for her to realize that. She didn't have to actually do the thing. She didn't have to actually, engage in any sort of physical conduct. In her mind, she was already sinning against God and against her husband with her desires. So you can see, coveting or desiring something that you shouldn't desire is just as much a sin against God as breaking any of the action-oriented commandments. And this plays into Paul's main argument against the law being sinful in an important way. And we're going to look at that more in a moment. But for the time being, I just want you guys to remember that sin is totally pervasive. It's really pervasive. And you need to also remember, though, that the point of the law is to reveal that sin to us. But that's not all that happens. Paul says, upon hearing the commandment to not covet, he goes on in verse 8 to show what happened once the law revealed that to him. So verse 8, but sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandments, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. So here we have a distinction that's really important in Paul's argument against the question posed in verse 7. So the culprit here is what? Is it the law? No, it's sin. The culprit is sin itself. It's not the law or the commandment that's evil. And when Paul was made aware that coveting was wrong, sin seized an opportunity in him. When he recognized, okay, this is wrong, it seized an opportunity in him. And another way to put this is it's like when you're at war and someone establishes a base of operations kind of in the enemy's territory, and they set up this base of operations, and they end up producing soldiers to go into that fight. They see an opportunity, there's an opening there, and they set up shop, and they start producing more and more things that go against that other army or that other person. And that's what's happening here. And what did this shop of sin produce? More sin, more ungodly desires. Now in practice, we know this happens. We know this to be true. In practice, we totally know this to be true. And it makes all the sense in the world. But how do we know that? How do we know it to be a true statement? We can tell by experience. When a person tells you no, you often begin to think of ways in your mind to get around that no. It's kind of your first thought. Don't tell me no, I got to figure out a way to get past it. I want to do my own thing. Put it another way. When you hear that you cannot do something or you're not allowed to do something, what do you want to do? You want to do the thing that you're not supposed to do. It's like when you walk in, you walk into a building and you see a door that says, no admittance. What do you think? I wonder what's in there. I wonder what's in that room. If you're curious. Maybe some of you don't struggle with that. If you don't, come talk to me and help me. But a lot of us really feel that way. Now, if we didn't know that it was wrong to do that thing, we probably wouldn't do it, or we wouldn't dwell on the fact that we want to do it. But as is so often the case, when we find out that the speed limit is 55, what do? We drive 57 or 70. We push the boundary. If we didn't know that the speed limit was that, we would never think about pushing the boundary. But because the speed limit's there, we push the boundary. We go past it just a little bit and then a little more because we haven't gotten caught, right? And then we go a little bit faster until we get pulled over in a school zone, and then you really are careful for a while. That's usually the way it works. We rewrite the law, as it were, to suit our own prerogative. And we've been doing this since the beginning. Adam and Eve. They're told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what do? They eat it. Okay, mankind really hasn't changed since Adam and Eve. We're really the same people that we've always been. And that's just the first of many examples throughout Scripture and throughout history of mankind becoming aware of a law and then breaking it almost immediately. Let me give you 2 examples. Okay? The first story is about my wife, and she knows I'm telling this. I did ask her beforehand. I'm getting better at that, about asking for permission. But she's in Sunday school, but she's totally cool with this. But it's about my wife. So when she was a little girl, she thought it would be a good idea to touch the antenna on the top of the TV. And for those of you who are too young to know what that means, TVs used to have an antenna on the top of them that you had to adjust to get the signal, and you actually had to tune your TV like a radio to get channels, and even then it was really fuzzy. I remember doing that as a kid. Maybe we just had an old TV. I don't know, but that's beside the point. But her dad saw her touching the antenna, and her dad quickly told her that she was not to touch that. You are not allowed to touch that. That's not okay. So now Erin knows what she's not supposed to do, right? She knows exactly what she's not supposed to do. Before it was just a simple curiosity, but now there's this law, and so new desires come into her mind. So what does she do? Well, a little bit later, okay? A little bit later, her dad peeks into the living room, and what is Erin doing? She's touching the antenna with a stick. Okay? Do you see? Do you see that? The touching of the antenna. She touched it, she received the law, and what happened? She got really creative. Her mind spurned all sorts of new ways to sin against her dad. Now, just yesterday, my daughter was with Erin, and they went over to Isaiah and Krista's farm to help kind of do some chores while they're out of town. And Idolette found a toad and wanted to bring it home. And Erin said, no, we don't bring toads home. There's a new law, okay? We don't bring toads home to our house. And so they're about to leave, and Erin asks Idolette where the toad is, and Idolette looks a little bit guilty. And so Erin told her again, you can't bring the toad home. So Idolette opens up her pants, of all places, and pulls the toad out. So that's creative. You could hide it behind your back, but no, she actually put the thing in her pants, for goodness sakes, and left the toad. But, before the law came, she was just going to carry this toad home, right? No big deal. But then the law came, and what did she do? She thought of all these creative ways of how to sin against the law. Isn't that interesting? And that's what we all do. And that's what Paul's talking about when he says in verse 8, but sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Notice, it wasn't sin. It wasn't the commandment that produced more sin. It's sin itself. And this is Paul's argument beginning to unfold. Look at verse 8 again. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. So we know that sin has been in the world since the garden, right? So how can Paul say that sin, how can Paul possibly mean that sin didn't exist apart from the law? How could he mean that? Well, he's simply reiterating his point that without the law, we can't know. We can't know whether what we do is good or bad in God's eyes. Without the law, we can't possibly know. God's character is revealed in the law, and without a knowledge of the law, sin doesn't really exist to you because you don't know that it's bad. You don't know that it's wrong. Now, Erin didn't think touching the antenna was sinful in her dad's eyes until he told her that it was. It wasn't until he brought the law in that she realized that, and that it was in opposition to her dad. And so that opposition, that sin against her dad, was actually dead to her. It didn't exist until that happened. Paul continues in verse 9, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. So let's look at this verse in 3 parts together, okay? So it's kind of chronological. So we're going to split it up into Paul being alive, then the commandment coming, and then sin coming alive, and bringing Paul to death. Now, this is all metaphorical. The Bible is not completely literal, so don't think, oh, Paul died or anything. I know you were thinking that, but just don't go off into a bunny trail there. The first question we really have to ask is, when was Paul alive apart from the law? When did he ever not have the law in his life? He was the Hebrew of Hebrews, right? He grew up hearing the law even since he was a little kid. He probably never even knew a time where he didn't hear the law. So what does he mean? Well, most likely he's referring to a time when he knew the law, but he didn't really know the law. He didn't really understand what it meant. He had it according to the letter, but not according to the Spirit. He knew it really well, but he didn't know it. So when he says that he was alive apart from the law, he's referring to a time when he really felt alive. He really felt like, I'm living the best life I can live because I'm following the law to a T. And we see that in Philippians 3:4-6 when he remembers, when he recalls how he thought about himself. Look at, this is the life, right? This is the life for him. Okay, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. He thought he was blameless. That's a good life. But he thought of it according to how he was living according to the law. He thought he was totally blameless. He thought, I'm the greatest of the great. I'm having a great life. So can you blame him for thinking that way? He thought he had it all. The truth is, he knew about the law, but it hadn't revealed his sinfulness to him. He didn't see it in that way. And that is until, as he said, the commandment came. Again, Paul was never without the commandments. It's not that he never knew them. But they didn't come alive to him. God hadn't revealed that to him yet. He'd seen the commandment not to covet his whole life, but it never really meant anything to him in his heart. And a lot of us, we look at commands of Jesus, we look at the commands, we look at the law or things like that. It doesn't mean anything to us. We don't care about it at all. And that's not a great place to be. That we need that revelation so that we can see that sin. And Paul hadn't experienced that. And just as a side note, we experienced this. Has anyone in here ever read the Bible and you've read a verse like 100 times, and then you hear someone give a sermon on it, or you talk to somebody about it, or whatever, and you say, gosh, I've read that verse 100 times, and I've never seen that in that verse before. That's kind of the idea. Paul knew this. He knew the text, but it hadn't come alive to him yet until Christ revealed it to him. Just like that example that I just shared. It showed Paul's sin in all its fullness. Now, the law wasn't just a moral tool, again, to gain righteousness. The law was a mirror to Paul, and it's a mirror to us. And Paul had never gazed into it and seen himself so clearly before. It never happened. So in that sense, the life he knew was put to death. Sin came alive, and Paul, feeling as alive as he did, was replaced by the reality that we probably all feel when we realize that we've sinned against God, is you feel dead. When you realize that you sin against a holy God, you feel pretty terrible unless you realize that Jesus paid for that. When you really recognize the weight of your sin and the burden of your sin against God, you don't generally feel very good about that. You don't generally feel very alive unless you have someone like Christ who's come in and taken your place. Then you feel alive because he's alive. Well, look, Paul continues. He says, verse 10, the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. The commandment to not covet, and really any commandment would work here, it promised life to Paul. But what does that mean? Well, we know that God gave the law, and we know that fulfilling the law, if we could do that, would be the best possible life. You guys recognize that, right? If we could live up to God's law perfectly, you'd have your best life now. I'll never quote that again, by the way. But in all reality, you would. You would have the best possible life if you could live up to the law. And so the law does promise that. The law says, hey, if you can do this, I promise you life. But then we all say, well, we can't do it. We can't meet the law. And so that what seems like a promise to us actually proves to be death to us because we know we can't attain it. All of us have lied. All of us have stolen. All of us have said false things about other people from time to time. And that's all enough to condemn us, even if we just did it one time. So, that commandment that promised life, actually to Paul, it proved, wow, I'm really dead. I'm really dead to God. Because I can't meet that. I can't live this life that I thought I could live. And then Paul says in Romans chapter 7, verse 11, this next verse, for sin, again, look at the same language. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. Remember, it wasn't the commandment itself. It was sin that deceived Paul and killed him. Paul uses the same language he did a few years ago, or a few verses ago. Sin, seizing an opportunity through the command. Now, why does he repeat himself so frequently? Because he wants believers to know that sin is the problem. Sin is a problem. Sin being over us and having complete control over us as Christians, not a problem. But sin deceiving us and creeping into our lives, that is a problem. He doesn't want us to just nonchalantly think about sin like it's no big deal. He's trying to draw the point home. You're focused on the law and how bad the law is. You shouldn't even be asking the question. You should be asking, how can I fight sin? How can I fight sin? And sin is so deceitful, even as how we think about the law. It can make us think that, if we can't obey the law, then we should just go on sinning. Have you ever had this thought? Like, wow, I can't live up to this standard that I have, so I'm just going to keep on sinning. I can't stop looking at porn, so I'm just going to keep looking at porn. I can't stop. Has anyone ever felt that way? I'm sure you have. Where sin has deceived you enough to think, I can't live according to some standard. And so, who cares? I'll just give in. I'll just give in. So sin deceives us into doing that with the law. Sin can deceive us with the law in making us antagonistic towards it. We look at its demands and we hold it in contempt, not thinking of it as good whatsoever, because it's like, I can't, how could I even think about that? Not to steal? I can't live up to that. I hate it. I hate that. That's bad. And that's the sin creeping in and deceiving you to think the law is the problem. The law is the problem. You can fall into what's called antinomianism, which is, it basically means against the law. And this is actually something that's really crept into the church. It's really crept into the church. It's all over the place, actually. But the idea that we don't have to care about the law or think about it anymore, it doesn't do any good for us anymore because we've received grace. And so, because we've received grace, we don't have to care if we sin. We don't need to be revealed. We don't need the law to reveal to us our sin because grace abounds all the more. And so, I'll just keep on sinning. So it's kind of the same problem as before, where the person said, well, I can't meet the law, so I just give up. I'm going to keep sinning. This is kind of the opposite, but the same problem, where the law doesn't matter, so I'm just going to keep on sinning. Grace is going to abound. And that's a problem. Sin also deceives us in thinking that if we can keep the law perfectly, then we're better than everybody else. It makes us arrogant, and that's what the Pharisees had the problem with. And I could go on and on about sin and its deceitfulness, but the point is that sin is the deceiver, not the law. The law was given by God, and sin has distorted how we look at it. Sin has snuck in, twisted it all up, and made us really confused about it. And in a sense, sin made the law evil in our minds. It made it really bad. So we avoid it. We don't think about it. We don't see any value in it. But that's why Paul continues in verse 12 and basically answers the question, the first question, in this way. He says, so the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. So in Paul's view, the law is not evil. It's not bad. If anyone knew the extent of the law and how it affects a person, it was Paul, right? He knew the law really well prior to Christ, and he knows the law really well and how a Christian should view it after Christ. And I've heard people say, the law doesn't matter for Christians. It serves no purpose, so we should just leave it be and move on. We shouldn't even think about it anymore. But I don't think that's what Paul's promoting here. He didn't spend the last, however many chapters talking about the law if it didn't matter at all. If it didn't matter at all, Paul wouldn't have said anything. He just would have said, okay, the law's gone, let's move on. But he doesn't. He keeps hitting it really hard. He calls it holy, and it is, because God created it. It's pure in its foundation, and sin twists it. And then he speaks of this commandment. He says it's holy and righteous and good. It's holy because God gave it to us. It's righteous because it's just. When we look at the law and we say, well, that's just wrong or that's bad, it's not. It's just. If you've sinned against a holy God, how do you know you've sinned against him? Because the law says, and it shows that he's just. He's not going to let sin go unpunished. People these days have all these issues with hell, right? Rob Bell wrote his book, Love Wins, a couple years ago, where hell doesn't exist and everybody's going to heaven. That is not a just and good God. There would be no reason to believe in God if he wasn't just. There would be no reason. Sin wouldn't matter. We could just do whatever we want all the time because God would never do anything about it. You know, we get really upset about Hitler and all these guys, and we don't say, gosh, I really hope that worked out for him in the end. No, we say, I hope that God poured his wrath out on that guy. In a sense, we should desire that everyone should come to grace. I don't want to say that we should be hoping that people spend an eternity in hell. Please don't hear that. But the reality is that God, if he were not just, would not be God. If this didn't exist, if there was no justice, it wouldn't be God. So the law, since it came from God, is just, it's righteous, and it's good because of all the reasons we already talked about. It reveals to us our sin so that we know how we've sinned against God, and so we know that we can't do it on our own, and so that we know that we need a Savior in Jesus Christ. And thank God that he sent us Jesus. You know, it's interesting, in evangelism, you don't think about this stuff. But don't you think it might be a little important to let people know that they've sinned against a holy God so that they can get saved from his wrath? It's not just, hey, I'm going to tell you about Jesus so you can have a better life. This is important. We have to recognize that we're sinners. We've sinned against God. We have to recognize that, or the gospel will not be beautiful to us. It won't be glorious to us. And so it is good. The law is good in that it directs us there. It directs us there. And we can really worship Jesus because how would we know that Jesus lived a perfect life and that he was the perfect substitute? Because we have the law to hold him against. Yes, he did this perfectly. He did this perfectly. We can see that he fulfilled all that, so he really can be our perfect substitute. It does matter. It doesn't run our lives. We don't gain salvation through the law, but there is value in it. It's good because of what it accomplishes. And you know what's interesting about the whole point of this message, the whole point, I think, of this passage, is we can have disdain for the law, or we can throw that out the window when we should be really having disdain for sin and trying and making every effort to throw that out the window. We should be really fighting against it. And just, I don't want to be a killjoy here. I kind of am in general, I guess, but I don't want to be a killjoy too much here, but think about how deceitful sin is. When I shared the example of my daughter and the example of my wife as a little kid sinning, we all laughed. Sin's funny when it's a kid. Do you see how sin deceives us? You look at it and you say, oh, Paul, don't be so serious about that. Well, was it sin or wasn't it? Was it offensive or wasn't it? Now you might say, oh, you're taking this too far. I'm not. See, what we do is sin deceives us into thinking we don't need to take it seriously. Even to the point where when my daughter sins, and parents, you know this, your kids are so stinking cute that you have a hard time being consistent in discipline and in correcting and in training because, oh, she's just so cute. Or he's just so wonderful. This is why parents, when teachers call home and say, hey, your son is like a total terror, and the mom says, no, he's not. He's perfect. Sin clouds your thoughts and veils your eyes so that you don't take it seriously. Listen, if you're a parent, your kids need to know that they sin. It's not just that they were behaving badly. They are sinning against God. And if you're not telling them that, then the gospel's never going to make sense to them. They're just going to think that, oh, okay, as a Christian, I just grow up and once I behave really well, I'm going to be a Christian. No. You are a sinner. What you just did was sin. And a lot of you might be recoiling a little bit, like, you really talk to your kids this way? Yeah, I do. Because that's the reality. That's real. I'm not going to approach my kids from the standard of the world where it's like, it's okay. It'll be fine. Now, I'm not super consistent, and I'll tell you why. It's because of this. It's because of this. Sin creeps in and says, don't take me seriously. I won't destroy you. I won't ruin your life. Yeah, some bad things might happen, but it's not going to be too bad because this is really nice, or this person's really cute, or this is okay. We have to be very, very careful about that. Very careful. We should not let sin have an inch. And if after all this time of Paul talking about sin, if we don't hate it by now, man, we just need to spend tons of time in here and ask that God would help us to hate it. We spend so much time hating all these other things that we don't take sin seriously. And so just as a transition verse into the next section, we're going to talk about this more next week. But you can see how Paul really just wants to make clear, it's not the law's fault, it's sin. Sin is deceiving us, it's tricking us, it's killing us. Verse 13 of chapter 7, did that which is good then bring death to me? Did the law bring death to me? By no means. It was sin, producing death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. And we're going to talk about that more next week. But just as we finish, if you take anything away from this, you can think about the law and all that kind of stuff, and it's good. But realize who the enemy is. It's not the good things that God has given us. It's how sin twists those good things and makes them evil and messes us all up. That's the enemy.